The story you are about to hear is a true story, a story of peace and brotherhood in the midst of war. The faces you will see are photographic faces of the family of the LCPC congregation. The 1900s, the final century of the recent millennium, brought unprecedented possibilities and promise. The children of these 100 years would see more improvement in the human condition than ever before in the world's history. Advances in medicine, science, and industry would all but eradicate disease, extend life, open communication among the peoples of the earth, and lift them into the vast reaches of space. But these hardly seemed like possibilities as the Christmas of 1914 drew near. The nations of Europe were at war. Anxious to expand and defend their borders, they summoned their best and brightest to the battlefront. Young men answered by the millions. A 19-year-old German boy left his job in London to enlist in the German army. English boys working and studying in Hamburg and Paris returned to London, donned uniforms, and went back to the front to fire upon former friends. Secretary of War Lord Kitchener expanded the British Army overnight by allowing schoolmates to enlist together. The tragedy of these PALS battalions was no more evident than at Somme, France. Hundreds of villages on both sides lost almost all their young men in a single battle. The little paybook that every British soldier carried included a last will and testament. Thousands of these booklets were collected from the bodies of young boys, many of them reading simply, "I leave everything to my mother." With hardly a backward glance, the promise of youth was poured into the blind and futile aggression known as the Great War, World War I. The new century brought a new kind of warfare. Field commanders quickly realized that digging in was the only way to survive the sweep of machine gun fire. The German army had marched across Belgium before being stopped at Flanders Field. Some 60 yards away, British, French, and Belgian troops languished in trenches infested with rats and lice, pelted with freezing rain and shrapnel. As temperatures dropped, disease took hold. Snipers picked off any who raised their heads above the earthen wall. Between the opposing trenches was an area about the width of a football field, no man's land. Littered with barbed wire and frozen corpses, it was a sobering reminder of what the future might bring. The war was but 4 months old, each side losing thousands a day, both to bullets and that silent, common enemy, influenza. Soldiers who survived later recalled their dead brothers being gathered up and stacked like cords of wood. By war's end, over 10 million would be lost. Not surprisingly, most of the soldiers were religious, the majority Christian. On Sundays, communion was passed in trenches on both sides. often to the sounds of church bells ringing in nearby villages. The occasional hymn was sung, and fervent worshiping voices were heard across enemy lines. By December, the war slowed, the task of draining trenches and keeping dry occupying much of the soldiers' time. As they contemplated their desperate situation, nights grew long and hearts yearned for peace. December 23rd, a group of German soldiers quietly moved to the ruins of a bombed-out monastery to hold their Christmas service. It was one of many held that season. Young men gathered to remember their dead, their countrymen, their families, and the Christ child. Later on that night, a few Christmas trees, Tannenbaum, as they were called, began to appear along the German fortifications, their tiny candles flickering in the night. Across the way, British soldiers must have taken an interest in those lights as they sang together the carols of their youth. Word spread, and heads peeked cautiously over sandbags at the now thousands of Tannenbaum glowing like Christmas stars. Two British officers ventured over to the German line and against orders arranged a Christmas truce. But the negotiation was a mere formality by then. Up and down the trenches, men from both sides already had begun crossing the line to join the celebration. Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse assaulted the enemy with music. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, "We are going to give the enemy every conceivable song, from Christmas carols to tipperary." The Germans responded with a Christmas concert of their own. It was not long before the cold air rang with everything from Good King Wenceslas to Auld Lang Syne. The response of the soldiers recalled the text of another English carol. Now to the Lord sing praises, all you within this place, and with true love and brotherhood each other now embrace. For the next 2 days, those tidings continue to spring from the hearts of common men who shared the common bond of Christ and Christmas. Further down the line, a German violinist stood atop his parapet, framed against the skeletons of bare trees and shattered fortifications. Delicately perched in this apocalyptic landscape, His cold fingers conveyed the poignant beauty of Handel's Largo. Whatever the spirit of Christmas had been before that hour, it was now, above all, the spirit of hope, of peace, the very peace promised by the heavenly host who first proclaimed Christ's birth. A British war correspondent reported that later the soldiers heard a clear voice singing the beloved French carol, O Holy Night. The singer, Victor Granier of the Paris Opera. The night watch must have lifted their eyes toward the heavens as they heard, long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. As Christmas Day dawned over the muddy fields, both sides cautiously picked their way through the barbed wire, and together they buried their dead. As they did, a German officer known only as Thomas gave Lieutenant Hulse a Christmas gift, a Victoria Cross and letter which had belonged to an English captain. Lieutenant Hulse responded by giving the German officer his silk scarf. One German retrieved a photograph of himself in uniform and asked his former enemies to post it to his sister in Liverpool. Men who had shot at each other only days before gathered in a sacred service for their fallen comrades. Prayers were offered, and the 23rd Psalm was read.
The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Oh, he restoreth my soul. He leadeth me unto the path of righteousness in his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. Oh, my cup runneth over. Surely Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
"19-year-old Arthur Pelham Byrne, who hoped to study for the ministry after the war was ended, remembered the Germans formed up on one side, the English on the other, the officers standing in front, every head bared. Yes, I think it is a sight no one will ever see again." As the Christmas of 1914 drew to a close, soldiers who had sung together, played together, and prayed together returned to their trenches to let the common ground between them become no man's land again. But even as the darkness fell around them, a lone voice floated across the few yards of earth on which they stood together. In the true spirit of Christmas, one voice, then another, joined in. Soon the whole world seemed to be singing, and for a brief moment, the sound of peace was a carol every soul knew by heart. And that's the way it was. One silent night over 100 years ago. And that's the way it will be as the pure light of God's love fills our hearts with his holy, heavenly peace.